Professors and members of the Board of Governors, ladies and gentlemen, existing students, new students of the Hertie School of Governance. I'd like to start by saying I consider the honour to be mine to be invited to address this audience today. Professor Zern gave me the theme of constraints and opportunities in global governance, or what's happening in global governance. I tacked on the bit about what can we learn from the WTO. I should start by saying that one of the things that's often said amongst the community of trade groupies is if ever you want to bring a dinner party to a conclusion, you start by saying, let's talk about the current state of the World Trade Organization and the future of the current round of trade negotiations. I want to try and convince you in my 25 or so minutes that there's actually quite a lot to be learned from this. I don't expect to turn you into trade groupies, but it is clearly one of the major areas of contemporary public policy, and some of you will indeed finish up as specialists in the area of what we might call global economic policy issues. So to the extent that I may have something to offer you, I'll try and do my best to put it in a context today. I also want to pick up on a theme that occurred to me while Professor Zern was giving his introductory remarks. And he quoted from Karl Deutsch about the importance of learning, and power being the ability not to learn. One of the things that one of the thoughts you might want to hold while I'm speaking to you today is about the dangers, and I apologise for the poor use of English language, but about the dangers of unlearning in public policy making and in the context of global governance. Because one of the things that concerns me, and the thing I'll try and identify, is that in some ways I think we are actually in danger of unlearning some of the very useful elements of global governance that we learned in the period of the second half of the 20th century. And some of the dangers in the global economic economy may well arise from a process of unlearning rather than learning. It will be my argument that we are actually facing a series of serious short and long-term systemic problems in the contemporary global political and economic orders as we come to the end of the first decade of the 21st century. And these are problems for scholars and citizens alike, and for many of you as policymakers and would-be policymakers. In the next 20 or so minutes, I'll say something about the current state of both theorising and practising global governance, but not in a purely scholastic way. I'm sensitive to the fact that the Hertie School is indeed a school of public policy and not a department of political science or economics. And indeed, I've watched the growth of Hertie, and I'm a committed believer in the importance of public policy as the bringing together of various disciplines in serious policy-focused, multidisciplinary fashion. So, let me start by saying something about the concept of global governance. Some of you may be at the stage where you're thinking, well, there isn't anything called global governance. It's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. And it's a plaything or a fantasy of scholars. Let me suggest that this is not the case, and that as you go through your studies, you'll come to understand that this is not the case. But what I would say is that in all theoretical contexts, global governance continues to become an increasingly salient, albeit contested, political concept. Moreover, the debate is no longer just the plaything of scholars. The dilemmas of global governance cast long policy shadows, and it's there that it represents an important theme or focus for the would-be scholar and practitioner in the area of public policy. The integration of the global economy through the liberalisation of the trade regime, the deregulation of financial markets, and the privatisation of state assets, has led to what we now commonly call globalisation. This has not been accompanied by a comparable development of what we might call the global polity. But it's increasingly recognised in policy circles that without the development of appropriate norms, institutions and processes to manage globalisation, many of the advantages that globalisation has brought could be undone by a failure to mitigate the excesses and the negative consequences of globalisation, especially for large sections of the world's poor. Now, this is not only the position of what we might call the alter-globalisation or the anti-globalisation movement, it is increasingly the position of impeccably credentialed scholars and analysts, from Jagdish Bhagwati to Nobel Prize winners like Joseph Stiglitz, major journalists like Martin Wolf in the Financial Times. They all recognise without proper processes of regulation, globalisation has within it the seeds of its own downfall. And so this is the well-known conundrum for advocates of globalisation, and it focuses on the dilemmas of global governance. So really we need to understand what the idea of global governance means in an era of contested globalisation. For most scholars and practitioners, global governance for much of the second half of the 20th century, and especially in the economic domain, and I'm going to focus on the economic domain today, is still predominantly seen as what I would describe as the effective and efficient collective action problem solving undertaken by international organisations. It's what governments and international organisations do collectively, what they can't do individually. Proponents claim that effective and efficient governance is not a normative but an empirical matter, and international organisations or international institutions, with states acting as their agents, are the principal vehicles for this activity. I would argue that in the early 21st century this is an increasingly deficient understanding of global governance. And it is so for two reasons. Firstly, it presents an excessively one-dimensional view of global governance institutions. Most scholars and practitioners today also begin to recognise that effective and efficient decision-making also has important normative implications, and consequently international institutions must address questions of accountability and democratic legitimacy as much as effectiveness and efficiency. Certainly more than they've done in the past, and more than many do at the present. Secondly, this understanding of governance just as effective and efficient collective action decision-making overestimates the role of international organisations in global public policy. And it overestimates them at the expense of both emerging state and non-state actors, operating in ways and in other regulatory contexts that differ from traditional understandings of international economic diplomacy as we knew it in the second half of the 20th century. And you, in your work and your scholarship over the next year or so, will come to look increasingly at the role of other non-state actors, regulatory actors, both public and private, that function increasingly in the process of global governance. In some key areas of the global cooperative agenda, in both the economic and the security domain, we appear to be witnessing, unfortunately, the deterioration of collective governance capacity, and indeed a resistance to its enhancement in some places. In some issue areas, the utility of institutions as vehicles for sharing information, building trust and enhancing compliance, learned in the second half of the 20th century, are coming unlearned in the present era as global public policy problems resist what I would call the technocratic fix and pose major political and ethical questions about the appropriate manner in which policy is made. And political and ethical dimensions of public policy making are as important, in my mind at least, as the technical and analytical elements of this process. Let me give you just one example. And I pick on this example because not specifically because, but incidentally because, you will actually, in the course of your studies, work with someone who has made a bigger contribution in this area than almost anyone else in the world. So let me talk about, just for a second, about politics in the area of what we might call global public goods literature. This is seen largely, I would argue, in the economics fraternity as the effective and efficient making of public policy where the enhancement of property rights and the reform and development of institutions is the key to success. In global public goods theory, politics is about the rediscovery of institutions. Now, these innovations are, of course, extremely important, but they are, I would argue, insufficient. To the extent that they privilege efficiency over accountability, they isolate the institutions of global governance from what we might call the traditional stuff of politics. Who gets what, how, when, where. And this is a problem for the major global institutions. And if we think about the World Trade Organization as my example here, its current Director General, who I know, respect, admire, and consider to have just about the worst job in the world, in some ways, Pascal Lamy describes the World Trade Organization as a global public good. Not only is this gross exercise in concept stretching, for many global rule takers, this is not self-evident. The struggle over the continued pace of economic liberalisation, notwithstanding global economic growth over the last 2 decades, remains, I would argue, a political struggle about the distribution of global wealth, not merely a technical economic question about how to produce that wealth. Now, this is even more so in the global financial domain in some ways than it is in the trade domain, where until recently, until the last 12 months, technical skill in the manipulation of markets has seemingly become a depoliticised and acceptable component of globalisation. This, I would argue, in the current era, is undergoing a process of transition, this judgment. And indeed, you could argue that in some ways, support for economic globalisation appears to have hit the buffers in the early 21st century. By extension, global governance and global public policy should be seen not simply as administrative sciences to accompany economic science. They remain, and must in some ways remain, contested political processes. And it's in this context that we should try to understand the contemporary global economic order, to be as analytically precise as we can, to bring to bear all those analytical skills that we have developed in the social sciences over the last 100 or so years, but to recognise that many of the problems that we face do not lend themselves in all circumstances to neat analytical models, but are contested, highly charged elements of a political domain. As citizens, we live in a challenging, and for some people, of course, tragic time. As students of public policy, and especially global public policy, we actually live in quite an exciting era. The trials and tribulations of the global economy are our field of inquiry, our laboratory, our research agenda. Let me say something about them for a few minutes. 2008 sees the global economy facing an unprecedented series of challenges. The financial crises resulting from the collapse of the US subprime mortgage market and the shocks that have reverberated beyond the United States confirm the irrevocable interdependence of the global marketplace. The subprime crisis has demonstrated that unchecked and underregulated markets are susceptible to all sorts of problems: corporate greed, inadequate risk management, and subsequent loss of confidence. The actions taken by the US Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world have shown the limits of the system to regulate itself and remind us that states, for all their limitations, remain the ultimate guarantors of economic stability and security. The case has never been clearer, I think, since the end of the Cold War and the dramatic expansion of globalisation, that some degree of institutional control is a necessary prerequisite for rational economic management. It's in this context that there is little doubt that the institutions which manage the global economy need to show greater coherence and a sense of purpose and recover legitimacy in the eyes of both ordinary people and national governments. This is a challenge for the politician and indeed the policymaker alike. So let me say something for a few minutes about the WTO as an example of an institution in this wider context that is clearly affected by the fallout from these current wider economic and financial problems. And indeed, the WTO itself, by its failure to complete its current round of multilateral trade negotiations, the Doha round, it too affects this process. As part of the project to create a global economy, the multilateral trade system is threatened by the perception that globalization has been tarnished by speculative investment and other excesses in financial markets. And this has created protectionist sentiment and attendant risks for the open marketplace in times of uncertainty. The spillover into the growing opposition to trade liberalisation might be irrational. I consider it to be irrational, but it's nevertheless real. Ironically and unfairly, the WTO frequently bears the criticism for the excesses to be found in other sectors of the global economy, and especially in the financial sector. It's apparent that in an increasingly interdependent world in which we find ourselves, trade policymakers cannot ignore either the context in which they operate or the need to contribute to the resolution of these challenges. Whether global institutions are capable of meeting these challenges is, of course, arguable. But these challenges raise major questions of international policy coherence. And it's in this context that the World Trade Organization finds itself in a malaise. Now, the answer to this malaise, or crisis, if you want to call it a crisis, but we use that word too much, I think, is not to jettison the WTO. And this, of course, is argued in certain parts of the political community across the spectrum. And it's not just the radical anti-globalizers that say, let's dismantle the WTO. Economic nationalists in the United States, in Europe, argue similar kinds of things, that the WTO is too intrusive into the policy process. Even had, for example, we managed to secure some kind of agreement in Geneva, it would have, in July, it's still clear that the global trade regime, as an institution of global governance, is in need of major reform. And the window of opportunity to undertake that is closing. It's closing in the face of the absence of political will, and this is especially generated during the looming United States elections, and indeed, for example, the Indian elections. So we need to think longer term about the future of a major institution like the WTO. Basically, to ask the question, if it didn't exist, would we invent it? My answer to that is unequivocally yes, by the way, and I'll try and suggest to you why. The WTO represents a laboratory for both the theorist and the practitioner of global governance. We need to get it right. And it faces 5 major challenges in the early 21st century. And these are challenges that will, in some ways, frame what we might consider to be those public policy questions that you will come to bear on in the course of your studies. The first major challenge is the disconnect between continued liberalisation and internationalisation of the economies of the major OECD countries on the one hand, and a marked reduction in popular support for this liberalisation on the other. Concern about stagnant wages, job losses, growing income inequality, environmental degradation are now central to the political debate in most industrialised countries. Trade, tragically, and let me put my normative cards on the table, normatively, trade is seen wrongly to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution in large sections of the community. Ironically, this trend is occurring at the same time as support for economic liberalisation is growing amongst the political elites in many of the larger, faster, growing developing countries. Recent polling by Gallup and Pew, for example, throughout 2006 and 2007, show not only strong support for open borders in the developing world, it also shows that support for globalisation is weakening in many OECD countries. The most common concern is whether unprecedented addition of large pools of workers from emerging markets and developing countries is adversely affecting compensation and employment in industrialised countries. This has been, for example, as many of you will be aware, common throughout the US presidential primary process. Now, the standard economic response to this dilemma, that liberalisation enhances aggregate welfare, I consider to be correct. But it does not solve the political problem. As students of public policy, one of the things that you'll come to recognise is that very often good economic theory is poor politics. Some objections to liberalisation are clearly just protectionism by other names, but if a knee-jerk nationalist response is to be avoided in the 21st century, then public policy must distinguish between politically inspired protectionism and legitimate welfare concerns. And I would hasten to suggest that this may well be a theme that many of you in your studies will visit over the next 2 years. A second challenge is the need to ensure that increasingly multipolar, or even what we might actually call non-polar nature of the global trading system does not itself become a source of stalemate and dysfunction. We're seeing a messy transition from one global economic equilibrium to another. New voices, new centres of political economic gravity are emerging, adjusting to the growing role of India and China and other key southern actors such as Brazil, South Africa and Mexico is a key lesson to be taken away from the failure of the current round of trade negotiations. The question that it poses for us is how do we ensure that these fast-growing, large emerging markets take up political leadership roles commensurate with their economic power, at the same time as assuring that the originally dominant actors, the United States and the European Union, do not disengage from this process. Do not, if you like, shift forums, walk away, look for other unilateral or bilateral approaches towards trade liberalisation. A third distinct challenge facing policymakers is the need to reconcile the competing objectives of international institutions. What should the role or remit of an international institution be? Where is governance more legitimately undertaken beyond the level of the state than at or below the level of the state? For instance, should the World Trade Organization confine itself to a limited number of trade-related measures, or should it gradually become the locus of a wider system of economic regulation in an increasingly integrated global economy? These questions speak to the very purpose of the WTO as an instrument of global governance. A similar story can be told about the lack of direction in the mission, for example, of the IMF in the post-Asian financial crisis of the last decade or so, and indeed the World Bank, although the World Bank has gone some way to refining its contemporary remit as a knowledge organisation in a way that neither the IMF or the WTO has been able to do. These are big questions. These questions cast policy shadows. They seem remote from the day-to-day life of human beings. We don't give our loyalty to international institutions. We give our loyalty to our family, our friends, our church, our community, not to institutions that we know as transaction cost reducers. It's difficult to have loyalty to a transaction cost reducer. A fourth challenge that the WTO needs to face goes to the heart of the wider question of contemporary global governance. That is the extent to which issues of fairness and justice and democratic accountability are addressed at the WTO. Decision-making processes have come under scrutiny, and not just because they influence outcomes, but also because of the political significance of procedural fairness in policy making. For for its own sake. My final and fifth challenge that I identify, the fifth major challenge for the system, grows partly out of a frustration with the slow decision-making processes that we see in the multilateral trade regime. And that is the rise of alternative venues for trade liberalisation. Policymakers are turning from other vehicles for reform, notably to bilateral and regional agreements. To be sure, frustration with the multilateral system is not the only spur to regional preferentialism, but experience shows that these alternative vehicles for reciprocal trade liberalisation have important knock-on effects for the multilateral trade system in particular, and for, I would argue, the support for multilateral global economic cooperation in general. The recent trend amongst larger countries to go outside the WTO to reach trade deals carries the risk of undermining the fabric of an inclusive, fair, stable, institutional set of arrangements to underpin international trade. And here some history is important too. History is important, I think, in public policy. Governments should not forget the lessons learned from the debacle of the largely institution-free trading arrangements of the first half of the 20th century. The consequence of the creation of parallel regulatory spheres at the level of the region, for example, in some cases makes international trade more difficult under the umbrella of the WTO. Now, regionalism is not going to disappear, nor is the WTO necessarily the best place to deal with it. But the explosion of regionalism in recent years has clearly been suboptimal in systemic and political terms in a number of ways. And this is why it is an important issue for students and practitioners of global public policy. The GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the originator of the WTO, and the WTO, for nearly half a century, have given voice and legitimacy to a set of rules and norms and principles that have allowed global trade to liberalise and the world to prosper. For that system to unravel, for want of attention to these rules, is a potential danger. And it looks like it's emerging in an era of what we might call non-cooperation. In the darkest form, neglect could portend a return to the beggar-thy-neighbour trade policies not seen since the interwar years of the 20th century. I'm not predicting this, but this is something that, at a time when other elements of the global economic order are suffering stresses in their own right, the world's population can ill afford. Let me take 1 minute to conclude. The global economy, and the multilateral trade system in particular, are at a crossroads. Support for an open, liberal trading system is neither consistent nor unambiguous. Trade liberalisation may well continue, even without a completed round of trade negotiations. But the other linked elements of this process, particularly support for principles and rules, the stuff of global governance more generally, are important. What I've tried to suggest is that some of the lessons about the importance of rules and principles in international relations, especially with regards to the values of institutions as venues and vehicles for global policy making, may be coming unlearned by some of the major players at exactly the time that they are becoming appreciated, ironically, by some of the smaller ones. We are in danger of unlearning some of these institutional principles, I would argue. That's the dark side of this story. But let me finish on a slightly more positive note. At another level, other agencies, new regulatory activities, global public policy networks are taking on a salience in the 21st century alongside, and in some instances in competition with, traditional multilateral institutions. Indeed, we may be entering an era of what Robert Kahane, perhaps one of the principal students of international institutions in the world today, has called contingent multilateralism, in which the major players, and especially the erstwhile hegemon, the United States, sets less store by the self-binding ordinances in the early 20th century than it did in the second half of the 20th century. And if that is the case, if we can no longer think of a grand institutional bargain in which the major players engage in this self-binding ordinance, then the rise of new agencies, new actors, non-state actors, various civil society groups, regulatory networks, the stuff of your studies, I suspect, over the next 12 months will become, or 2 years, will become increasingly important. These are challenging times for students of global governance, but I think they are not times without interest. Allow me to close, therefore, by saying that I wish you all well in your studies. I think global public policy, as part of a broader context of studying public policy, is an important, interesting and relevant area of activity. It's not everyone's bag, but I suspect by the fact that you're in this room, it is in part your bag, and I wish you well in your studies. And I thank you for listening to me. Thank you.